Sartre's freedom, the burden of self-creation. The philosophical framework established by Jean-Paul Sartre in his magnum opus, Being and Nothingness, presents a revolutionary and often terrifying conception of human existence centered on radical freedom. Unlike previous schools of thought that sought to define humanity through a pre-existing nature, divine order, or biological imperative, Sartre's existentialism begins with the bold, uncompromising assertion, existence precedes essence. This is not a mere academic distinction, it is the cornerstone of his entire worldview, proclaiming that for the human being, there is no blueprint, no inherent purpose, and no fixed nature waiting to be fulfilled upon birth. Sartre insists that we are initially born into the world as nothing more than a conscious presence, a blank slate or, as he might say, a being that is for itself, conscious subjectivity, rather than in itself, a non-conscious object. Whereas a manufactured object, like a tool, has a defined purpose and structure, essence, before it ever exists, the human being simply is, and only after existing does it begin the process of defining what it is. This means that every action, every thought, and every choice we make is not the result of a pre-programmed nature, but a direct, unmediated act of self-creation. This complete absence of predetermination is the source of our absolute freedom. We are not merely free to choose between different brands of coffee, we are free to choose the meaning of our life, the values that guide us, and the very identity we project into the world. If we feel compelled to be a doctor, a criminal, or a saint, this compulsion is not mandated by nature or God. It is a choice we make and continuously remake through our actions. We are, at every moment, the author, director, and lead actor of our own unscripted play. However, it is precisely this boundless freedom that transforms into a profound burden. The popular, simplistic notion of freedom as doing whatever one wants quickly dissolves under Sartre's scrutiny, replaced by a much heavier reality. If there is no external guide, no divine law, no universal human nature, and no fixed moral code, then the individual is entirely, singularly responsible for everything they are and everything they choose to be. There is no one else to blame, no outside force to appeal to for justification. This overwhelming responsibility gives rise to the existential state of anguish, angoisse. Anguish is not mere fear, it is the unsettling realization of the total weight carried by every decision. When I choose, I am not merely choosing for myself, I am implicitly choosing an image of what I believe a human being ought to be. By acting, I am saying, this choice is valuable, and thereby endorsing it as a model for all humanity. The sudden dizzying sense that one's personal action has universal implications is the very core of this unique existential dread. Sartre famously summarized this predicament by declaring that man is condemned to be free. This powerful phrase highlights the involuntary nature of our liberty. We did not ask for this freedom, we are simply thrust into it. Once we are conscious beings, we cannot escape the necessity of choosing. Even choosing not to choose is itself a choice and a form of action. Our freedom, therefore, is not a joyous escape from duty but an inescapable, heavy obligation that we must carry every waking moment. The constant temptation to avoid this burden leads many to engage in bad faith, Mauvaise Foi. Bad faith is the self-deception by which one tries to convince oneself that they are not free. This is the mechanism by which people pretend their circumstances, their past, their societal role, or their overwhelming feelings utterly dictate their actions, transforming themselves from a dynamic, conscious subject, for itself, into a fixed, determined object, in itself. For instance, a person in bad faith might claim, I have to do this because it's my job, thereby denying the radical freedom they possess to quit the job, protest the task, or even change their attitude toward it. Bad faith is a fundamental lie about one's own nature, an escape route from responsibility, but ultimately, a failure to live authentically. Thus, the journey of self-creation, according to Sartre, is a relentless, ethical struggle toward authenticity. To live authentically means facing the anguish head-on, acknowledging the total responsibility of one's choices, and refusing to engage in bad faith. It is a continuous moment-to-moment commitment to creating one's own essence without external justifications, knowing that every act defines not only the self but contributes to the definition of human reality. In conclusion, Sartre's philosophy elevates human existence to a staggering, terrifying height. Freedom, the ultimate prize of consciousness, is simultaneously the ultimate challenge. It demands that we embrace the solitude of our decisions and the lack of a predetermined map. The price of this immense liberty is the inescapable burden of self-creation, a perpetual task that makes every person not just an inhabitant of the world, but its relentless, self-defining creator. The principle of existence precedes essence. The foundational axiom of Sartrean existentialism, existence precedes essence, is not merely an abstract concept, it is the radical demarcation point that separates human reality from the rest of the universe. To grasp its profound implications, one must first consider the nature of an artifact, a manufactured object like a paper knife or a chair. For such an item, its essence, its defining characteristics, purpose and blueprint, is conceived in the mind of the artisan before it is ever brought into physical existence. The paper knife is what it is meant to be before it exists as a physical object. Sartre contends that theological and secular philosophies alike have traditionally reversed this order for humanity, treating us as if we were complex artifacts. Theist philosophies suggest a creator who has a perfect, predetermined concept, an essence or soul, for humanity before any individual is born. Secular humanists, too, often posit a fixed, universal human nature, a set of defining qualities like rationality, aggression, or morality, that every person inherently possesses from the start. Sartre vehemently rejects both these notions. He argues that if God does not exist, or even if we ignore the question of a creator, there is no one who can conceive of a human essence beforehand. The human being, therefore, is not born with a definitive nature, rather they are thrown into the world, a conscious, undefined presence. We simply are before we are anything. This is the core meaning of existence precedes essence. We exist first, encounter ourselves, surge up in the world, and only afterward do we define ourselves through the totality of our lived experience and choices. This principle renders the individual a fundamental nothingness nent, at the core, not in a nihilistic sense, but as a lack of fixed, positive attributes. This lack is the space of our freedom. Because we are not defined by a pre-existing essence, we are perpetually engaged in the act of self-definition. We are not what we are, but what we choose to be. The past actions, skills, and titles that others assign to us, our facticity, never fully capture or contain the freedom we possess to project ourselves beyond those definitions. The comparison to the manufactured object highlights the gravity of this difference. The paper knife cannot decide to be a tool for something else. Its essence is fixed. The human being, conversely, is in a continuous state of becoming. If I am a teacher today, that is a role I have chosen and constantly revalidate. It is not my unchangeable essence. I always retain the radical freedom to quit teaching, to define myself as an artist, or simply to resist all labels. This is why, for Sartre, consciousness, le pour soi or being for itself, is a constant dynamic surge toward the future, an endless process of transcendence over any static definition. We are essentially a project, forever incomplete. The moment we try to claim, I am a courageous person, we have fallen into a mild form of self-deception, or bad faith, because that declaration attempts to fix a fluid, free consciousness into a static essence. The realization of this empty core, this fundamental lack of definition, is what distinguishes human reality, reelite humane, from all other things in the world. Objects, animals, and non-conscious reality, en soi or being in itself, are fully and completely what they are. A rock is simply a rock, without the power to question, reinterpret, or redefine its rockness. We, however, are forced to define our humanness with every single choice we make. Therefore, the principle of existence precedes essence demands that every individual bear the total weight of their own identity. There is no authority, neither a divine entity nor a universal moral code, to which we can appeal to justify our actions or define our purpose. We invent our meaning as we go along. If life has meaning, it is because we have chosen to endow it with meaning through our engagement with the world. This means that the responsibility for one's life is absolute. If a person finds themselves lacking courage, it is not because they were born without courage, but because they have chosen, through a series of actions or inactions, to define themselves as cowardly. There is no inherent psychological weakness to blame, there is only the choice. This ruthless self-accountability is the direct ethical consequence of the foundational axiom. In sum, the principle that existence precedes essence liberates us from the tyranny of a fixed nature, but it simultaneously condemns us to the terrifying obligation of continuous self-creation. It is the philosophical statement of our radical freedom, transforming human life from a process of discovery, of a pre-existing truth, into an exhausting, yet exhilarating process of invention, of self and value. This initial, stark realization sets the stage for the anguish and responsibility that characterize the rest of the existential journey. The anguish of choice. The inescapable realization of radical freedom, established by the principle that existence precedes essence, directly generates the state Sartre termed anguish, angoisse. This term, central to existential thought, is often misunderstood. It is not merely anxiety, fear, or panic, but a unique philosophical disquiet rooted in the complete and total absence of external justification for one's actions. It is the dizzying awareness that, at the moment of choosing, the individual stands utterly alone, with the entire weight of their uncreated being resting upon that single decision. Anguish arises because when a human being makes a choice, they are simultaneously doing two things. First, they are defining themselves as a specific, acting individual, and second, they are, in that very act, choosing an image of humanity as they believe it ought to be. Sartre writes that when we choose, we are not just choosing for ourselves, but we are choosing for all mankind. This does not mean everyone will follow our choice, but that we are declaring, through our action, this is what is valuable, this is how a person should act in this situation. Consider the example of a person grappling with a moral decision, perhaps choosing between staying to care for an ailing mother or leaving to join a resistance movement, a classic dilemma Sartre explored. There is no pre-existing moral law, no ethical formula, and no religious commandment that can definitively resolve this conflict. The person cannot turn to a moral authority for an answer because, as a free being, they must invent the value of their choice in the very act of choosing. The individual is thus compelled to legislate not only for themselves, but for the universal human condition. When they choose the mother, they affirm the value of immediate personal duty over abstract, collective heroism. When they choose the resistance, they affirm the opposite. The anguish felt is the profound realization that the individual is creating a moral precedent without any guiding star. They cannot escape this universalizing weight. This is what distinguishes anguish from common fear. If a person is afraid of a tiger, the fear has a defined object and a rational cause. Anguish, by contrast, has no definable object other than the sheer possibility of the future and the responsibility for that possibility. It is the gnawing uncertainty that there is nothing, absolutely nothing, to guarantee that the choice made is the right one, save for the brute fact that one chose it. Furthermore, anguish is intensified by the fact that the individual is choosing based only on their subjectivity. They cannot appeal to objective truth or an eternal nature because those things do not exist before the choice is made. They are creating their own essence, their own set of values, in the process. The choice is made without external crutches, in a state of abandonment, the term Sartre uses for the realization that God, or a fixed human nature, is absent. The common human response to this anguish is often a flight into bad faith, Mauvaise Foi. People try to relieve the burden by pretending they were forced, that anyone would have done the same thing, or that their choice was determined by their personality, their upbringing, or external forces. They seek to turn their dynamic freedom pour soi into a static determined object, en soi. However, Sartre maintains that true freedom requires confronting the anguish. To live authentically is to recognize the horror of total responsibility and the lack of external justification, yet to choose anyway. The individual who fully accepts their anguish is the one who understands that they are not merely reacting to the world, but are perpetually designing their existence, including the moral fabric of that existence. The persistent presence of anguish is, paradoxically, the confirmation of our freedom. The moment a person feels that overwhelming sense of dread, it proves they have realized that their actions are not predetermined and that they are, in fact, the sole source of value in their subjective universe. It is the psychological price paid for the privilege of being a self-creator rather than a programmed machine. In conclusion, the anguish of choice is the necessary emotional and psychological accompaniment to Sartre's radical freedom. It is the profound existential vertigo experienced when the individual looks into the abyss of absolute possibility and realizes that they are the one who must draw the line, establish the rule, and bear the entire universal consequence of that self-legislated act. The burden of self-creation is felt most keenly in this paralyzing yet necessary state of dread. Condemned to be free. The most striking and often quoted pronouncement from Jean-Paul Sartre is the declaration that man is condemned to be free. This powerful, almost oxymoronic phrase captures the tragic dimension of human existence. It instantly subverts the common understanding of freedom as a sought-after privilege or a political right, reframing it instead as an involuntary, inescapable condition, a kind of metaphysical sentence passed upon every conscious being from the moment they emerge into the world. To be condemned implies a lack of choice regarding the condition itself. We did not choose to be conscious. We did not choose to be the kind of being for whom existence precedes essence. Yet, having been thrust into this conscious state, le pour soi, we are instantaneously burdened with the absolute necessity of choosing our being. This is the ultimate existential paradox. We are free, but we are not free not to be free. Our liberty is not a gift we can reject, but an unshakable yoke we must bear until death. This condemnation arises from the realization that once we acknowledge the absence of a fixed essence, we recognize that there is absolutely nothing that can justify, define, or compel our actions other than our own will. We are like a captain who finds himself alone on a vast ocean. He is free to steer in any direction, but he is condemned to choose a direction, even drifting aimlessly is a choice, and is entirely responsible for the fate of the ship. The condemnation signifies the abolition of all external excuses. There are no pre-written moral codes inscribed in the heavens, no set of immutable instincts that can fully determine human action, and no psychological history so profound that it negates the power of the present choice. If I act dishonestly, I cannot truly claim, my father made me this way, or society forced my hand. Sartre demands that we recognize the ultimate moment of decision belongs, irrevocably, to the self. Furthermore, we are condemned to be free because the moment we attempt to escape our liberty, we engage in bad faith, Mauvaise Foi. Bad faith is the self-deception that occurs when we attempt to view ourselves as an object, soi, a being whose actions are dictated by circumstances or a fixed character. For example, the perpetually timid person who says, "I just can't speak up, I'm simply a shy person," is attempting to make shyness his unchangeable essence, thereby denying the continuous freedom he has to choose to speak differently. Sartre points out that even in the most restricted environments, such as a prison cell, radical freedom remains. While a prisoner cannot choose to walk through the walls, he can choose the meaning he assigns to his imprisonment. He can choose to view his cell as a temporary setback, a catalyst for inner reflection, or an irreversible defeat. The physical facts, facticity, are inescapable, but the freedom to transcend those facts by assigning the meaning is always preserved. This condition of condemnation is ultimately tied to the philosophical state of abandonment. In an atheistic worldview, we are abandoned because there is no God to give us a purpose, to provide a moral law, or to guarantee an afterlife. This abandonment leaves man totally alone and without help. The condemnation to freedom is the inescapable consequence of this solitude. Since there is no one above man to tell him what to do, man is forced to rely solely on his own resources to invent the meaning of his existence. The immense psychological weight of this condemnation is what creates anguish. Anguish is the feeling we get when we realize that everything we are about to choose lacks any external, definitive justification. We must step forward into a realm of pure possibility and establish value through our movement. This is the heavy price of not having been created with a nature, but rather having to create one's own nature. In recognizing this condemnation, the individual achieves the highest form of self-awareness. It means understanding that one is, at every moment, the absolute legislator of one's subjective universe. This realization shifts the perspective from asking, "What should I do?" to the much deeper and more terrifying question, "What meaning am I going to invent here?" Therefore, to be condemned to be free is the central tragic triumph of Sartre's philosophy. It strips humanity of every comfort and every excuse, laying bare the frightening reality of our autonomy. It demands a life of perpetual creation, where responsibility is absolute, and every pause, every delay, and every action is a moment in which the individual self-legislates, forging their essence in the heat of an inescapable, awesome liberty. Responsibility and abandonment. The immense weight of radical freedom, the necessity of defining one's own essence, is inextricably linked to two core Sartrean concepts, responsibility and abandonment. For Sartre, these are not separate moral considerations but two sides of the same existential coin. Abandonment refers to the realization that, with the non-existence of God and the absence of a fixed human nature, we are utterly alone, without external moral guidance. This solitude then amplifies our responsibility to a terrifying, absolute degree. The concept of abandonment stems from an atheistic premise. If there is no supreme creator, then there is no divine intellect or perfect consciousness to conceive of a definitive human essence or purpose before our existence. Consequently, the world lacks a pre-established moral order. There is no heaven-sent set of values, no 10 Commandments, no eternal ethical laws, that can serve as an objective compass for human conduct. We are, as Sartre puts it, condemned to be free, because we are abandoned by any such comforting external source of meaning. This realization of abandonment is not a nihilistic call to chaos, but a philosophical demand for self-legislation. If God does not exist, then everything is permitted, not in the sense that we can do anything without consequence, but in the sense that there are no pre-existing moral restraints. This freedom, however, does not make life easier, it makes it infinitely harder, as every value we embrace must be invented by us in the act of choosing. It is this vacuum of pre-existing meaning that elevates responsibility to its absolute height. Since no eternal law dictates the choice, the individual must step in and become the sole source of justification. Every action is therefore not just a personal preference but a profound moral construction. When one chooses to be courageous, honest, or dedicated, one is not discovering these values. One is creating them and validating them for oneself in that moment. Sartre insists that this responsibility is total. It extends not only to the immediate consequences of our actions, but to our very being. If I am lazy, I cannot deflect blame onto my upbringing or my genetics. I am lazy because I have chosen, through a series of acts, to define myself as a lazy person. This ruthless self-accountability means that we are solely responsible for our facticity, our current reality, because we constantly choose the meaning we assign to it. The crushing weight of this total responsibility is magnified by the universal dimension of every choice, a concept directly related to the anguish discussed earlier. When I choose, I am choosing for all mankind. This does not mean everyone must obey, but it means I am endorsing my choice as a model of what a human being ought to be. The individual is forced to realize that in their private, subjective moment of decision, they are creating a universal image of human worth. For example, a student choosing to prioritize cheating over hard work is not merely making a private, pragmatic decision. They are choosing to establish the value that, in their view, academic integrity is dispensable. They are responsible for making that value exist, not just for themselves, but as a statement about what is permissible in the human realm. The natural human tendency is to flee this crushing responsibility and the isolation of abandonment by falling into bad faith. People seek refuge by appealing to determinism, claiming they were forced by their circumstances, their feelings, or social pressure. They try to treat their free consciousness, pour soi, as a determined object, en soi, thus attempting to shed their absolute responsibility. However, for Sartre, true ethical living authenticity requires the individual to face both the abandonment and the responsibility without flinching. To be authentic is to fully accept the terrifying realization that you are the ultimate, unguided source of your own values and the designer of your own essence. It is a mature acceptance of one's solitude in the universe. In conclusion, responsibility and abandonment define the ethical terrain of Sartre's philosophy. Abandonment strips the human being of every external guide, leaving them nakedly free. This absolute freedom then necessitates an absolute, total responsibility for the invention of all personal and universal values. The burden of self-creation is thus the perpetual task of an abandoned being, forced to be the ultimate solitary legislator of their own existence. Bad faith, Mauvaise Foi. Faced with the profound, inescapable burden of radical freedom and total responsibility, the average individual instinctively seeks refuge. This flight from liberty takes the form of bad faith, Mauvaise Foi, which Sartre defines as the fundamental act of self-deception. It is the conscious attempt by the human consciousness, le pour soi, to deny its own freedom and instead view itself as a fixed, determined object, en soi, thereby avoiding the anguish of self-creation. Bad faith is not simply lying to others, it is a lie told to oneself about one's own being. It manifests when an individual attempts to escape the crushing weight of their perpetual need to choose by pretending that their essence is already fixed, like a rock or a manufactured tool. This deception allows the person to say, "I can't help it, that's just the way I am," or "my circumstances force me to do it," thereby effectively shedding their responsibility for the choice. Sartre famously illustrates this with the example of the waiter in the café. The waiter performs his role with a rigid, overly precise, and almost mechanical grace. He is playing at being a waiter, attempting to dissolve his subjective, fluid being into the objective, fixed essence of the role. By clinging so fiercely to the definition of waiter, he denies his own freedom to be something more or other than that social function. He denies his ability to quit, to be clumsy, or to simply be an individual who happens to wait tables. Another classic example is the woman who goes out on a date and allows her companion's suggestive hand to rest on hers. She avoids acknowledging the full implication of the gesture, treating the hand as a mere thing and her own body as separate from her conscious will. She delays the moment of choice, whether to withdraw her hand or fully accept the advance, by dissolving her present, choosing self into an inert, passive entity. This procrastination through self-deception is the essence of bad faith. The core mechanism of bad faith lies in the tension between one's facticity and one's transcendence. Facticity refers to the immutable facts of one's past, physical body, history, and social roles. Transcendence is the ever-present freedom to project oneself beyond those facts, to choose the meaning one assigns to them. Bad faith occurs when a person attempts to view themselves only as their facticity. I am defined only by my history of failures, thus denying the possibility of transcending that history. Conversely, bad faith can also occur when a person attempts to live only as their transcendence, completely denying their facticity. The person who constantly lives in a fantasy world, believing their current reality has no bearing on them because they are destined for greatness, is also in bad faith. Authentic existence requires holding the tension between one's fixed facts and one's continuous freedom to choose their meaning. In professional or social life, bad faith is rampant. The employee who claims, "I have to follow orders, or I'll be fired," is often in bad faith, ignoring the freedom to choose to quit, to object, or to take a principled stand. They pretend their action is determined by a simple cause and effect, rather than recognizing that they are choosing to accept the threat of being fired as a determining factor in their actions. Sartre views bad faith as fundamentally annihilating to the self. By denying one's freedom, the individual prevents themselves from genuinely creating their essence. They choose to live a life determined by others' expectations, societal norms, or past habits, effectively forfeiting the central human mandate of self-creation. It is a state of moral blindness that prevents the experience of genuine authenticity. Crucially, bad faith is always unstable. Because the individual is fundamentally and ontologically free, the deception can never fully succeed. The person knows they are lying to themselves. The freedom they try to suppress always lurks beneath the surface, threatening to burst out and reveal the true depth of their responsibility. This is why the waiter's motions are always a bit too stiff. The performance is a perpetual, fragile attempt to contain the subjective self. Ultimately, recognizing and resisting bad faith is the primary ethical hurdle in Sartre's philosophy. The individual must be relentlessly honest with themselves about their autonomy. The burden of self-creation demands that we stop making excuses, admit our utter responsibility, and embrace the horrifying truth that we are the sole, unguided architects of our being, defined not by what we are, but by what we will ourselves to be. The facticity and the transcendence. Sartre's conception of the self, and thus the entire dynamic of self-creation, is defined by the inescapable tension between two fundamental components of human reality, facticity and transcendence. These two aspects exist in a perpetual dialectical relationship, where freedom resides not in the absence of limitations, but in the power of the conscious mind, Mauvaise Foi, to continually interpret, re-evaluate, and surpass those limitations. Facticity refers to the collection of immutable brute facts about an individual that they did not choose. This includes everything that is simply true about them as an object in the world, the time and place of their birth, their physical body, their race, their history, the language they speak, and the role society has imposed on them. These are the givens of existence, the circumstances that constitute the material setting of one's life. A person cannot change the fact that they were born in the 20th century or that they possess a certain height. These are unalterable facts. Transcendence, conversely, is the core of human freedom. It is the conscious self's inherent capacity to surpass its facts, to project itself forward into the future, and to choose its own meaning. Since the human being is fundamentally a nothingness or a lack of fixed essence, we are constantly defining ourselves by looking beyond what we currently are. Transcendence is the dynamic movement of the self away from its fixed past and toward its possibilities. It is the power that allows us to assign meaning to our facts. The individual is never simply their facticity. If a person is poor, that is a fact, but the freedom of transcendence lies in choosing the meaning of that poverty. Does it become an insurmountable barrier that justifies an action, or does it become a catalyst for revolution, extraordinary work, or artistic expression? The fact remains constant, but the meaning, which is created by the individual's choice, is fluid and constantly subject to redefinition. Bad faith, Mauvaise Foi, is the direct result of trying to collapse this essential tension. It occurs when a person attempts to escape their responsibility by clinging solely to one pole. They may attempt to live only as their facticity, saying, "I am a failure because my circumstances made me one." This turns their life into a fixed object, denying their freedom to surpass those circumstances. The timid person who claims, "I'm just a shy person," is denying the power of transcendence that allows them to choose a different, bolder action in the next moment. Equally, bad faith occurs when a person attempts to live only as their transcendence, ignoring the concrete limitations of their facticity. This is the delusional state of ignoring one's past mistakes, physical ailments, or social realities. The authentic life, by contrast, demands a mature, unflinching recognition of the facts while simultaneously using the power of freedom to assign the meaning and project new possibilities. This tension explains why Sartre describes the human being as a being which is what it is not and is not what it is. This paradoxical statement means that, as a conscious being, I am my facticity, the history, the body, the past roles, but I am not it because I am always free to transcend it. Conversely, I am not my chosen future because I haven't fully realized it yet, but I am that choice because I am constantly choosing to project myself toward it. The ultimate significance of facticity and transcendence is that they define the true arena of human responsibility. We are not responsible for having our facts. No one chooses their birthplace. But we are absolutely responsible for the attitude, the project, and the meaning we assign to them. This is the heart of the burden of self-creation. We must continuously choose to make ourselves from the raw material of the facts we are given. For example, a physical disability is a powerful facticity. The authentic individual acknowledges this facticity fully, without pretense. However, they exercise their transcendence by choosing to define their life not by the limitation itself, but by the goals they pursue despite or because of the limitation. They do not allow the fact to become their total essence. In conclusion, the constant interplay between facticity and transcendence is the engine of human existence. The fixed reality of our past, facticity, provides the foundation, but the relentless freedom of our consciousness, transcendence, is the construction crew. The authentic life lies in accepting the limitations of the former while relentlessly exercising the creative, defining power of the latter, thus navigating the heavy, yet magnificent burden of continuous self-creation. The look of the other. Sartre's philosophy, while primarily focused on the subjective freedom of the individual, Mauvaise Foi, recognizes that existence is never truly solitary. The self-creating subject inevitably exists in a world populated by other conscious subjects, the other, and this interaction introduces a crucial, often destabilizing dimension to one's freedom. This phenomenon is captured in the concept of the look, le regard, a powerful force that momentarily challenges the individual's radical autonomy and introduces the self to an objective, external reality it cannot fully control. The individual consciousness experiences itself as pure transcendence, a perpetual movement beyond any fixed definition. We are a dynamic flow of possibilities, never fully captured by our past or our current facticity. However, the moment the other looks at us, we are abruptly and momentarily halted in our transcendence. We are instantly transformed from a free defining subject into a defined fixed object, Mauvaise Foi, in the other's world. This is the profound alienation inherent in the look. The classic illustration of the look is the person peering through a keyhole. Engaged completely in the act of observation, the person is pure, defining subject, totally absorbed in their project. But if they suddenly hear footsteps and realize they have been seen, they are immediately stripped of that subjective freedom. They no longer see the world, they are seen by the world, fixed in the objective definition of peeper or spy. The shame felt in that moment is the instantaneous acknowledgement of this objectification. This feeling of shame is a key indicator that we have been objectified. Shame is not simply guilt over a specific action, but the feeling of being seen as something by another consciousness. It is the realization that the other's freedom has now defined our being, giving us an outside, a public essence, that we did not choose. We become aware of our own facticity and finitude through the judgment of another's gaze. The look of the other is thus a continuous threat to our sovereign freedom. It forces us to confront the fact that our project of self-creation is not performed in a vacuum. The values, meanings, and identities we invent for ourselves are always subject to interpretation, judgment, and fixation by others. My essence, the public face I present, is perpetually being created and potentially distorted by the millions of others who gaze upon me. Sartre further argues that this objectification is the root of most human conflict and social tension. We constantly struggle against the definitions imposed upon us by others. We strive to maintain our status as pure subject, while simultaneously attempting to define and objectify the other in order to reaffirm our own subjective dominance. This inherent tension, the desire to be subject while making the other an object, is why Sartre famously concluded that hell is other people in his play, No Exit. However, the presence of the other is also philosophically indispensable. It is only through the encounter with the other's gaze that we become fully aware of our own objectivity, our own facticity, as perceived by others. This recognition, that we exist not only for ourselves but also for others, forces us to take the universal dimension of our choices seriously. Our responsibility is amplified because our chosen self is now a public entity, subject to external standards. Furthermore, the encounter with the other acts as a mirror, revealing the limitations and distortions in our own self-creation project. The opinions and judgments of others, though sometimes stifling, prevent us from falling into total self-absorption or a particularly egregious form of bad faith, where we ignore the objective consequences of our actions in the shared world. In an authentic existence, the individual does not attempt to eliminate the look, an impossibility, nor do they surrender entirely to the definitions imposed by it. Instead, the authentic person confronts the objectification, accepts the existence of the public self, but continues to choose their subjective meaning in spite of the external gaze. They acknowledge the judgments without letting those judgments negate their fundamental freedom to transcend them. Therefore, the look of the other stands as a powerful check on the burden of self-creation. It introduces a challenging social dimension, reminding the individual that their project is not a solitary affair. While the gaze can induce shame and objectification, its recognition is necessary for authentic human existence, forcing the free subject to constantly negotiate their subjective liberty with their inescapable, objective reality in a world populated by equally free and demanding consciousnesses. The look of the other. Sartre's philosophy, while primarily focused on the subjective freedom of the individual, Mauvaise Foi, recognizes that existence is never truly solitary. The self-creating subject inevitably exists in a world populated by other conscious subjects, the other, and this interaction introduces a crucial, often destabilizing dimension to one's freedom. This phenomenon is captured in the concept of the look le regard, a powerful force that momentarily challenges the individual's radical autonomy and introduces the self to an objective, external reality it cannot fully control. The individual consciousness experiences itself as pure transcendence, a perpetual movement beyond any fixed definition. We are a dynamic flow of possibilities, never fully captured by our past or our current facticity. However, the moment the other looks at us, we are abruptly and momentarily halted in our transcendence. We are instantly transformed from a free defining subject into a defined fixed object, Ellen Soy, in the other's world. This is the profound alienation inherent in the look. The classic illustration of the look is the person peering through a keyhole. Engaged completely in the act of observation, the person is pure, defining subject, totally absorbed in their project. But if they suddenly hear footsteps and realize they have been seen, they are immediately stripped of that subjective freedom. They no longer see the world, they are seen by the world, fixed in the objective definition of peeper or spy. The shame felt in that moment is the instantaneous acknowledgement of this objectification. This feeling of shame is a key indicator that we have been objectified. Shame is not simply guilt over a specific action, but the feeling of being seen as something by another consciousness. It is the realization that the other's freedom has now defined our being, giving us an outside, a public essence, that we did not choose. We become aware of our own facticity and finitude through the judgment of another's gaze. The look of the other is thus a continuous threat to our sovereign freedom. It forces us to confront the fact that our project of self-creation is not performed in a vacuum. The values, meanings, and identities we invent for ourselves are always subject to interpretation, judgment, and fixation by others. My essence, the public face I present, is perpetually being created and potentially distorted by the millions of others who gaze upon me. Sartre further argues that this objectification is the root of most human conflict and social tension. We constantly struggle against the definitions imposed upon us by others. We strive to maintain our status as pure subject, while simultaneously attempting to define and objectify the other in order to reaffirm our own subjective dominance. This inherent tension, the desire to be subject while making the other an object, is why Sartre famously concluded that hell is other people in his play, No Exit. However, the presence of the other is also philosophically indispensable. It is only through the encounter with the other's gaze that we become fully aware of our own objectivity, our own facticity, as perceived by others. This recognition, that we exist not only for ourselves but also for others, forces us to take the universal dimension of our choices seriously. Our responsibility is amplified because our chosen self is now a public entity, subject to external standards. Furthermore, the encounter with the other acts as a mirror, revealing the limitations and distortions in our own self-creation project. The opinions and judgments of others, though sometimes stifling, prevent us from falling into total self-absorption or a particularly egregious form of bad faith, where we ignore the objective consequences of our actions in the shared world. In an authentic existence, the individual does not attempt to eliminate the look, an impossibility, nor do they surrender entirely to the definitions imposed by it. Instead, the authentic person confronts the objectification, accepts the existence of the public self, but continues to choose their subjective meaning in spite of the external gaze. They acknowledge the judgments without letting those judgments negate their fundamental freedom to transcend them. Therefore, the look of the other stands as a powerful check on the burden of self-creation. It introduces a challenging social dimension, reminding the individual that their project is not a solitary affair. While the gaze can induce shame and objectification, its recognition is necessary for authentic human existence, forcing the free subject to constantly negotiate their subjective liberty with their inescapable, objective reality in a world populated by equally free and demanding consciousnesses. Conclusion. Jean-Paul Sartre's existential philosophy, encapsulated in the title Sartre's Freedom, the burden of self-creation, ultimately presents humanity with a stark choice: embrace the terror of absolute autonomy or flee into the comforting illusion of predetermination. The journey through his core concepts, from existence precedes essence to the necessity of authenticity, reveals that the human being is not merely free to choose, but is relentlessly forced to choose, thereby forging their identity and values in a world devoid of any objective moral guide. The initial chilling realization of existence precedes essence strips away every external justification for being. By denying the existence of a fixed nature or a divine blueprint, Sartre leaves the individual stranded, yet supremely empowered. We are, at our core, a nothingness of fixed definition, which means our essence must be perpetually authored through the accumulation of our actions. This makes the self-creation project not a voluntary pastime, but the fundamental, unavoidable task of consciousness. This radical liberty generates an overwhelming sense of anguish, the existential dread that comes from recognizing that every personal choice carries a universal weight. It is the realization that in choosing for oneself, one is implicitly legislating for all humanity. This anguish is compounded by the philosophical state of abandonment, the total isolation felt in a universe without a god or inherent moral laws, where the individual must invent the very values they choose to follow. The psychological response to this burden is often the flight into bad faith, Mauvaise Foi. This self-deception manifests when individuals attempt to deny their fundamental freedom by viewing themselves as fixed objects, soi, determined by their past, their roles, or their emotions. The refusal to acknowledge that one is always free to choose differently is an inauthentic attempt to escape the crushing responsibility that accompanies total freedom. The genuine human struggle, therefore, is defined by the tension between our static past and material circumstances, facticity, and our boundless capacity to project ourselves beyond those facts, transcendence. Authenticity requires the individual to unflinchingly acknowledge the limitations of their facts, while asserting their freedom to choose the meaning they assign to those limitations. The freedom lies not in changing the facts, but in changing the self's relationship to them. Furthermore, the act of self-creation is complicated by the presence of the other, whose look momentarily freezes and objectifies us. This external gaze forces the individual to realize that their private subjective project is subject to public interpretation and judgment. While this gaze can feel like a hellish form of alienation, its recognition is necessary for authentic living, compelling the free agent to choose in a shared world. The ethical ideal of authenticity thus emerges as the only viable response to the human condition. To live authentically is to resist the temptation of bad faith, to embrace the anguish of groundless choice, and to accept total, absolute responsibility for every action and inaction. It is not about what one chooses, but the lucidity, honesty, and freedom with which one chooses. In accepting the condemnation to be free, the individual transforms what seems like a curse into a profound opportunity. By taking ownership of one's life, the individual transcends the deterministic forces of nature and society, achieving a unique dignity. They cease to be a puppet of instincts or social forces and become the self-legislating author of their own destiny, forging a life that is truly, uniquely theirs. The burden, then, is the price of our magnificence. It is the inescapable weight that proves we are not defined by biology or divine command, but by the courageous, continuous deployment of our own will. This burden is heavy because it is total, but it is glorious because it certifies our status as ultimate creators of value in an otherwise meaningless world. Ultimately, Sartre's final word is a demand for courage. The philosophy does not offer solace or easy answers. It offers a rigorous framework for living a life defined by conscious choice. The burden of self-creation is the unavoidable cost of human existence, but in carrying it, the authentic individual fulfills their deepest mandate, to invent themselves and in doing so, to define what it means to be a free human being.